Whoops, what happened to my Periscope? Oh, let's try this one. Come on. Oh, no, that's XSplit. Sorry, I'm on the wrong one. Here we go. Paste. Oh, that turned me sick. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is Debbie Aldridge, and tonight I have my special guest on our Sunday night special. And I got to turn that. Oh, you probably can't hear that. Oops. Hang on 1 second. We're having a little technical difficulties. There we go. All right. So I have my good friend and a special guest Sunday night, Lieutenant Colonel Sargis Sangari, and welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you on again. This is a really important show, and just a little note here, we had some technical difficulties, and that's why we're running a few minutes late, but we're not letting it get us down. So anyway, so glad to have you on again.
It's good to be here, Debbie. I always enjoy the discussion.
Absolutely. So I always love hearing from you. And tonight, we're going to talk about what is happening in Syria. And being that you have served in that part of the country, you're also were born in Iran, but you're an Assyrian. So you have a lot of inside information about what's going on in Syria right now with Erdogan, his invasion into Syria. And I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to let you take it from here for a minute. Give us some background, and what do you think is going on? And the U.S. has withdrawn. So my first question actually is this Erdogan's attempt to be the next caliph and the resurgence of the Ottoman Empire? So, and it very well could be. I've been calling him he has Rouhani envy.
Well, there's nothing new that is happening in Syria. Syria's been like this for years, even before the U.S. ever had a presence physically on the ground. Like, it is a reality. I mean, we wrote on the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement years ago and said that what is happening today was actually going to happen. We wrote an article in 2015 that actually predicted where our foreign policy was eventually going to have to lead to. The maturations that you see within the region are an internal fight between Islam. Everybody's trying to be the lead for Islam. So they'll continue to fight this fight out within the Middle Eastern countries, and then we'll see who's going to be the victor. As it stands now, right now, Iran's still ascending and is expanding its footprint as a regional hegemon. And eventually we're probably going to get to the table to strike a deal with Iran that is more beneficial to us than the previous deal, which was an economic deal more than a nuclear deal. And the Sunni states are going to be just laid waste, as they are currently just basically destroying themselves.
It is so sad when you look at what Iraq and Syria has gone through in the last, 5 to 6 years. Cities have been destroyed, absolutely destroyed. One of the things that I'm not sure if our American public understands there are different factions besides the ethnic groups of the Turks, the Syrians, the Kurds, and the Iranians, of course, involved. There is that. Can you explain to us the difference in a layman term of the different groups of the PKK and we have the AKP? These acronyms are so, I think, complicated for lay people like myself, the average American citizen, to understand when they're hearing all these terms in the news. And how do these groups affect what's going on right now?
Well, I mean, these groups are the reason why the current POTUS said we need to withdraw from the region. I mean, he's looking at a 20-year perspective, where we're going to be. He's not looking at immediately what's happening on the ground. I have a lot of friends of mine who were not happy about the president withdrawing from Syria. And I said, look, I understand your concerns because you're looking at it from a soldier's perspective. Soldier's perspective is always looking at it from immediately what is happening on the ground. I mean, when I was given a mission, when I was in the Army, that mission had to be executed. And the execution of that mission was ended now. As soon as I, went out the wire, for the better term, your life depended on the, where we're going to end up at the end of the fight. But you cannot, from a statesman's perspective, look at it and what is happening within the region from a soldier's perspective. Soldiers are always going to disagree with the commander-in-chief, but the commander-in-chief is a dual-hatted. He has to look at it from a long-term policy perspective for the U.S. If you take a look at Turkey right now, the Kurds, as we have said, and a lot of people come out and say they're our allies, they're our friends, we should be supporting, and we've been supporting the Kurds going back to the 1960s. Mm-hmm. In the 1990s, basically what we did was we became their de facto air force. They were the only ethnicity in the Middle East region that ever was given an entire air force of a major nation to protect them. When we set up the no-fly zone form in northern Iraq during the first Gulf War, the first thing that the Kurds did, the Kurds that belonged to Jalal Talabani and the ones that belonged to Barzani, killed each other to the tune of between 10,000 to 20,000 casualties of two different tribal Kurds killing each other on the battlefield in the northern mountains of northern Iraq. So currently, the same Kurds are killing each other in Syria. Mm-hmm. When people say Turkey's invaded and is killing the Kurds that were our allies, Turkey is attacking the PKK Kurds. They were killing the PKK Kurds when the U.S. forces were on the ground.
Explain what the PKK is.
Because there's several is another faction. Yeah, mm-hmm. It's just another faction of the Kurds. Just like I said, you had the Jalal Talabani Kurds, different than the Barzani Kurds, different than the PKK, which is in Syria. So Turkey was bombing him already. Turkey was conducting ambushes against them. Turkey was killing them. The only difference was nobody was complaining because you had forces on the ground. And the PKK was stating that, we're allies of the United States, although every funeral that you'll see for the PKK, they fly the hammer and sickle on it because they've always been friends of the Russians. And as soon as the U.S. says, I'm going to withdraw my soldiers because I don't want to have them on the ground getting killed for no reason, first thing they do, the PKK that was supposedly enemies of the Assad regime, started brokering a deal with Assad. So their only long-term perspective from their side was to keep the U.S. there. As long as the U.S. there, they were going to be on our side. The second U.S. decides to leave the Assad regime that they're supposedly historical enemies of, they're starting to break deals with them. At the same time, when Turkey is moving into these smaller villages up in the north, attacking the Kurds, it is not the Turkish regular army that is conducting the majority of these operations. They do it through their proxies, just like we do through our proxies. They're actually paying for the Free Syrian army to conduct these operations. Guess who's involved in those operations? There are Kurds in the Free Syrian army that are against the PKK. So you have Kurds that are on the side of Turkey killing Kurds that are not on the side of Turkey at this time. In northern Iraq, Turkey has been conducting bombing campaigns against the so-called Kurds that are against it, the PKK Kurds that conduct terrorist operations within the borders of Turkey, and it's bombing them in the northern villages of Iraq, which nobody's talking about. Who is supporting the bombing operations that Turkey is conducting in northern Iraq? It is actually the Barzani Kurds that are enemies of the PKK, that are actually some of the spotters that are calling in those airstrikes with the Turkish Special Operational Forces operating in the north to kill those PKK members. So Kurds have always killed each other. They've done it in numbers, as I told you. Even in the 90s, they did it to the tune of almost between 10 to 20,000. So this mentality that exists is a tribal mentality for these folks. They will shift to where they believe that they could get the majority of support and the dollars and the money. Now, put on top of that, compile it with all these nations, like you said, Turkey, Erdogan wants to be the caliphate of the new Middle East, fighting for trying to expand his power base in both Iraq and Syria. And unfortunately, as Turkey has now committed to this fight in Syria, he's going to have to go as far forward as possible because any type of retreat, Erdogan will lose his political bases within Turkey. He also would have to tactically expand his footprint in Iraq. Why? The same Kurds that are supporting Turkish operations in northern Iraq, in this case the Barzani Kurds, are also at the same time funneling support to the PKK that they're fighting against in Iraq and Syria. How are they doing? Through the same lines that the PKK and the Barzani Kurds use to move ISIS oil in support of Turkish wants and desires, selling it directly to Turkey, which turned around and sold it to the European nations. And we found that out when our Delta operators went in and killed Abu Sayyaf, who was a main oil financier for the ISIS operators going back years ago, where we realized that ISIS was using Kurdish regional government areas, to include the ones in Syria that we were protecting, to move oil through those regions with an understanding that the Kurds at that time on both sides were going to make money off of this process, which means they had broken a deal with the Kurds into Turkey, which was supplying the ISIS operators that were flying into Turkey and crossing the border. This is nothing more than a shell game, given that everybody in the process, one, wants to be the lead for Islam, two, is making money through the process. So they're willing to kill each other. Now, why would the United States be committed to be in this fight, having our guys, young men and women, getting blown up and killed for these individuals to settle a score on the ground and make a buck? That makes no sense. Either we're going to have a long, enduring policy for the region, or once and for all, we have to allow them to basically kill each other on the battlefield until they figure out that the only way they can profit is to get to the table and strike deals which are profitable for all of them, rather than just individuals.
Yeah, it's been really confusing, even for me, who understands the tribal situation. And I just want to clarify for the audience that, and I have a guest on here, Sharon, our friend, asked about ethnic cleansing, and that actually was one of my questions coming up. But the Kurds, like the Arabs, like the Egyptians, like the Turks, let's just kind of lay these groups out. The Kurds are a group of people, but within that group of ethnic people are tribes. Just like in Saudi Arabia, every region has its own tribe in Saudi Arabia. So to kind of separate the whole term, and I think that's been some of the confusion for a lot of Americans, that the term Kurds is just being thrown out there, and yet not understanding that we're talking about also Kurds that are from different tribes who are warring against each other as well. And then you have Turkey in the mix. Where is Iran in this picture, and where is Assad in this picture? We know Putin's now coming in, and so that's another one of my questions is that we have, let's see, Putin in the mix, Erdogan in the mix, Iran's in the mix. The only one that's not in the mix, and Assad, is the U.S. We have withdrawn.
Look, it's not just tribes when it comes to the Kurds. It is also families. Mm-hmm. So literally, major families are the ones that are head of these tribes. So it's a family fighting against family. Hatfield and McCoys, if you want to consider it.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah. So in this capacity, I personally will not commit U.S. forces for these family structures to be able to settle their fights. And as they fight on the ground, they are also using us in a means and ways to promote their leadership at the top when it comes to internal fighting. I'll give you an example. Years ago, when we committed our Delta operators and special units to hit a so-called ISIS facility where they were holding Kurdish, supposedly, captives, there were no Kurdish captives in that facility. It was the Barzani at that time was having internal struggles within his own party. And there were a number of individuals who had risen against him and did not like his leadership style. Because there was going to be a split within his party, what do? Suddenly the so-called camp appears. We have to commit our forces to go in and fight and try to rescue these so-called hostages that are Kurds. But at the time, the Kurds had already been moved, if there were any. Again, I say if there were any from that camp facility, there were a number of Arab that were being held within that facility. So our operators go in, we lose two of our top men in that fight. Why? Because Barzani is trying to solidify his power base by committing U.S. forces to an operation to turn around to tell everybody else who's against them that U.S. is still standing with me. And I think the current POTUS has realized that no longer are we going to allow these individuals to use us for their benefit. So, look, when you're looking at Assad and when you're looking at Iran, let's take Assad as an example. Assad used ISIS for his benefit too. As ISIS started expanding in the region, because Turkey was pushing ISIS into Syria in order to be able to expand its footprint within Syria to begin with, Assad, every time he surrounded ISIS, he always gave him a backdoor to escape. Why? Because it made sense for him. The longer ISIS was still operating on the ground, the more it was apt that he would sustain himself longer in leadership, and that the major powers in the world would have to come to the table and start striking agreements in order to support Assad in the long run. Today, Assad is sitting in a position where he's able to have China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and others bidding to the tune of billions of dollars for reconstruction of Syria. And they don't care if Assad is there or not, as long as they have a hand in those contracts. If those contracts are opened up to them by the Assad regime, guess what? Assad's going to remain where he is, because he's basically moving dollars and money into the hands of these governments. And all these governments are tied to this Shanghai Cooperation Organization that is trying to expand its base within the region. As far as Iran is concerned, Iran is very simple for them. Iran has 40 years been expanding within the region, and none of the Sunni states have been able to be competitive against it. Iran by itself brought all the U.S. Security Council nations to the table, sat across from them, and struck a deal, which was more of an economic deal than a nuclear deal. The only reason why we realized on the previous POTUS that this deal is not going to work out was because the Europeans went to Iran and tried to undercut us. How were they undercutting us? They were going in, paying actually money to the Iranians on the street to hold demonstrations, scream "Death to America," and while they were sitting in the buildings that those demonstrations were being being conducted with their dollars, stating to the Iranian businessmen, once the deal was struck with Iran under the previous POTUS, hey, look, why do you want to have a direct deal with American businesses? Have them come through us. Your own people are screaming death to America. And it was a way that the Europeans tried to undercut American businesses. Because once we struck that first deal, the first people that were in Iran were the American oil companies. So the current POTUS realized what the Europeans were doing to us, which is a reason the deal was, we pulled out of the nuclear deal, and we're trying to strike a new deal with Iran. As we're trying to strike this new deal with Iran, as we put sanctions against them, pressure them, as an example, we keep the port of Charbagh open for them, which allows India to be able to develop that port to run a rail line for Iran into Afghanistan to put pressure on Pakistan. And just today, the Pakistan Prime Minister is in Iran trying to broker a deal between the Iran and the Saudis. Who send them there? The Saudis send them there. Why did the Saudis send them to Iran? Because the Saudis are not going to fight against Iran. They don't have the ability. Mm-hmm. They don't have the means. They have the money, but they do not know how to organize like the Iranians do to use it for their advantage in the long run. Why is Pakistan there? Because Pakistan economy is hurting. Because their economy is hurting, Saudi's going to give them money to break their Orchidage deal. Recently, I think everybody has heard that the president had maybe thought about using billions of dollars to give to Iran to help this negotiation that we're in to go move forward. That money is not coming from the U.S. That money is coming from France, who's going to be basically giving it as a line of credit for Saudi in order to be able to have Saudi turn around, give that money to Pakistan because his economy is hurting in order to broker this deal. This is a charade and a shell game for all these economic decisions that are being made on the ground between not just forces that are fighting on the ground, but the long enduring forces that want to see that they all have a stake within the region.
Yeah, it is so interesting, and wow, you just laid so much out there, like this big circle, of connecting the dots of Pakistan and Iran to Saudi Arabia to France to, it makes more sense that Trump, now that you laid it out, that he would withdraw. We don't need to shed any more American blood. And that's one of the things, I've kind of been on both sides, not really sure. It's been very, getting any news has been very disjointed, it seems like. And you kind of put those pieces together. And obviously, President Trump has intel and this information that you're sharing with us about all of these connections that are making making decisions based on monetary gain for themselves, and maybe going through the back door, through another back door to get to the front door. And all this other stuff is kind of a distraction or jogging for position, it seems like, in this region. And Trump maybe has said, I don't want to be a part of this. We have nothing to gain in this deal that these people are trying to broker. So having said all, is that kind of the right track that?
Yeah, that's look. One thing I did with the Near East when I set it up was try to show link analysis to average Americans as to how these things work together. And there's always an economic benefit to everything that takes place. ISIS cannot operate without money, just like Al Qaeda cannot operate without money, just like AQIZ cannot operate without money. All these specific operational groups work with money, and what happens? Major nation states that see a stake for themselves. As an example, just a couple of days ago, there was a meeting in Cairo. Even the Arab League that condemned Turkey's operation could not have a unified statement against them. Why? Because Qatar, who was giving money to Turkey to be able to have a stake for its future in Syria, who was funding the Free Syrian Army, said no. They didn't say no because of some moral guidance. They said no because They got money at stake. Iran has money at stake. China has money at stake. Russia has money at stake. I think people have to realize this. Well, the problem with Turkey is, just to kind of close out Turkey's going to have to move into Iraq. From a tactical standpoint, I think with the president pulling our guys out, not only is this finally going to, as we had said on the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement, the last two pieces of the puzzle for solving the Middle East issue are Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Turkey is now committed. If we hadn't pulled out, Turkey would have never been committed to a fight in Syria. Now that Turkey is committed into a fight in Syria, guess what else they're committed to? They're the ones who finance ISIS. They're the ones who moved ISIS into the location. Now they're going to inherit not just those 10,000 prisoners that are probably out by now anyway.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. Was it about 100 that escaped in a recent bombing or more?
Listen, all of them going to be released. Turkey knew who all those prisoners were, and the Kurds who were guarding them knew who all of them were, because most of them were the ones who drove the Lebanese plated trucks through their territory, taking oil through northern Iraq, Kurdish regional government territory, into Turkey to sell to Europe. So, like I said, everybody knows everybody there. And unfortunately for us, the same Kurds who were supposed to be our allies were allowing ISIS to move oil through their areas, and the people that they're guarding against, majority of them that we initially fought in Syria, not now, but majority of them that we initially fought were actually Kurds who joined ISIS, that were part of the same clans that were tied to that internal fight that the Kurds were having between Barzani and other factions, to include the PKK. PKK has moved into Sinjar. They moved into Sinjar when the PUK Kurds, which belonged to Barzani, decided to grab and run back to Erbil. So as they abandoned the Yazidis on the battlefield to get massacred, the ones that actually moved in were the Kurds that were opposite of the Barzani Kurds that were PKK into Sinjar. The problem is now they're sitting in Sinjar. Barzani is trying to dislocate them from Sinjar. What better way to do it is to have Turkey to come in to dislocate those Kurds that are against his family and against his wants and desires. And Turkey would have to do this. If it doesn't move into Sinjar, it will not be able to cut off the supply line of the goods and monies that are going to flow through Iran, from Iran, I should say, through the northern Iraq, Kurdish regional territories, into Syria to support a possible fight against Turkey. Look, it's a mess. And so what am I going to do? Commit my guys to die? I'll give you another example. There's the Arba'in of Hussein is going on currently, which is basically a high prophet in the Islamic religion. Iran has close to 4 million people that are transitioning through this process to celebrate his martyrdom in Iraq. Mm-hmm. Iran sends 4 million people. These people are coming supposedly in the name of peace in order to be able to celebrate and prophet of Islam. U.S. sends soldiers. Okay? A soldier, at the end of the day, is going to get killed, or he's going to be withdrawn. That's it. Mm-hmm. We send soldiers, they send people. They send 4 million people, we send a number of soldiers, and we think that we have an effective foreign policy. You want to have an effective foreign policy? Pull the soldiers out, have a means and ways, have a place where Americans can go and start striking business in the region. Unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult to do, because the first people who might be against us would be our own European allies, mm-hmm. who would never want to see us open up the Iranian bazaars for our benefit in the long run, or the Chinese. This is a global fight that is manifesting itself in the Middle East. Why? Because as long as you have the hadiths, as long as you have Sharia law at the core basis of the majority of the Islamic nations that are working under Islamic constitution, those nations will never be stable. And the foreign powers know that, and they use it to their advantage. Even they know that. as head of families of the various different nations, and they use it to their advantage. So the poor guy on the ground gets killed. Family members make money to the tune of millions, if not billions. A majority of that dollar makes it back to the U.S. Or Europe, stable nations, where they buy their homes and have their foundations and their organizations set up, to include their lobby groups. They are lobbying on their behalf against the in Congress against U.S. Foreign policy decisions that the current polls has taken.
Wow, that there is so much there, and it really makes sense because totally makes sense. The UE has been not necessarily on the side of the U.S. in wanting to make foreign policy that actually might change what's happening in the region. They continue to pander to Iran and to these other groups, and it makes real sense now the way you laid it out for us. One of the things that I have two questions. Well, I've got others, but two questions from the audience. One is, who funds Al Qaeda? That's number one, and the other one of the questions I have is, so Trump just sent 3,000 U.S. troops to Saudi Arabia. So can you explain that strategy, and then who is actually funding Al Qaeda? Or is it a conglomerate?
Al Qaeda is well financed, is well trained. Al Qaeda is well financed and is well trained. We're not going to get into the issues of who funds them and where they get their money, but anyone can launder money through the process of Al Qaeda. Anyone. Look, one of the biggest issues. Let me give you a different example. Maybe this is a little bit out of the region. Let's go to North Korea. President Bush, President Clinton said, you know what? North Korea has issues with its fuel capability. Why don't we give them our diesel? Which we did. We gave diesel to them under the concept that they're going to use it for humanitarian reasons. They're going to be able to keep their people, safe, warm. Well, they took that fuel. They made synthetic drugs. They sold the synthetic drugs to South America. South America gave them the component pieces that they needed for missile technologies, which they turned around and sold to Iran. Okay? Al Qaeda gets a lot of money through these type of processes. And don't be surprised if, you have different nation states that are trying to get into the region that support different type of businesses that, as far as they're concerned, they could care less what those businesses do in the long run. We want to strike a deal with China. We cannot have China go into Syria to strike a deal with Assad for the tune of those billions of dollars that we talked about. Why can't we allow that to happen? Because it would put us in a worse position with the Russians than we are currently. Because as much as we are adversaries with the Russians in the region, we also understand that if we continuously keep on beating up each other, Chinese are waiting to come up to pick up the pieces after we're done. Mm-hmm. So because China, even though it's part of the SCO, just like Russia is, cannot get into Syria, we're going to give them a little bit out. What is the out that we're going to give them? Is basically possibility of them to have future contracts in Iraq. Recently, the leadership of China was in Iraq to try to negotiate deals for China in the future. That release of pressure allows us to get the Chinese to agree to what we want when it comes to the pressures we're putting on them on the tariffs for new contractual obligations between us and China. Okay? China is responsible for the eradication of the Muslims within its borders. It is even destroying their cemeteries. When the Near East, when we went to Burma, we realized that the Chinese companies, to include Huawei, who runs the basically all the infrastructure in Burma, is part of that process. Now, the Chinese have an agreement with all the Sunni states that if the Sunni states allow them to be able to go in and develop those markets, then the Sunni states probably won't have to worry about ISIS operating within their borders. And China has the abilities to be able to track and suppress those type of operations within the borders of those Sunni states. This is how these organizations work. Al-Qaeda has a certain philosophy. It is a ideology that is the embers on which the Middle East has been burning, Europe has been burning for years, and if that ideology ever makes it to the U.S. and has come across the border a number of times, it will do the same thing here. However, there's money behind it. So you could look at it from an ideological perspective, a terror group, or you could look at it from a means and ways by which, if you want to name it a company, a lot of money gets funneled back and forth for the various interests of various different people. I told you, we found out that oil was being moved through Kurdish regional government into Turkey and sold to Europe.
Unbelievable. It really is unbelievable. So it really has less to do with ethnic cleansing and territory, more to do with economic, kickbacks and.
Well, no, I mean they'll cleanse people. Yeah, they'll cleanse people out. It's easier to work with one character than multiple characters.
Yeah. So there is ethnic cleansing going on as well, but the bottom line is an economic advantage, and jogging for that economic advantage, a payoff. Whoever's doing the bidding, it seems like whoever's willing to pay.
Well, look, I mean, I use the example of the Holocaust. And I hate to be crude about it, but the ovens that were built to literally burn Jews to ashes, those started being built years ago, prior to the Holocaust. It didn't happen by magic. The warning signs, to include from the ambassador of the U.S. and Germany, were sent back to the United States. But you had too many companies who were making too much money at the time with their current regimes, and they could care less. Look at the Christians of Middle East as an example. Assyrian Christians in Iraq went from 1.5 million to 150,000. They got eradicated. Who was on the ground when they were getting butchered? U.S. military force structures, everybody. SOCOM, Navy SEALs, you had 82nd Airborne. You had NATO on the ground. You had NATO forces on the ground. You had the Australians on the ground. You had the Koreans on the ground. What happened? Why were they getting butchered? Did anybody do anything about them? Did we give them a 1 brigade of equipment to protect themselves? No. We gave a regional government to their historical enemies and said, here you go. They're under your control. What was the first thing that the Sunni Muslim Kurds did during the 2014 genocide, where the Assyrian Christians and the Yazidis got butchered? They took the weapons of the soldiers that we forced through our State Department to have to serve under the Kurdish regional government, if they were going to get any support from us. They took the weapons and on the cover of night took off. The PKK Kurds went and tried to at least stop the advance of ISIS against Sinjar, but Syrian Christians went from $500,000 homes to being refugees in the streets. And the first place we literally protected, as ISIS started continuing attacking against the Kurds who were leaving the battlefield, was an Erbil. And the president at that time, the POTUS, President Obama, said that we have to make a stand there. Those Syrian Christians ran into Erbil, not because we wanted to run into Erbil, because these were the same individuals who were supposed to protect those Syrian Christians, who took the weapons from their soldiers and took off and abandoned them. Ran there because the only place that U.S. decided to draw the line at that time on the previous POTUS was Erbil. That Erbil cannot fall. It's not to our interest. That wasn't just moral interest, it was economic interest. Because majority of the oil to sustain Iraq was being shipped through there. The current fight that you see in Iraq, where there has been uprisings, is over the fact that since 2003, 410 billion barrels of oil have not been accounted for. Or I should say money has not been accounted for, not oil. So $410 billion are missing. Iraq makes 3.1 million barrels of oil a day. It has 38 million people almost within its borders, and it cannot even feed them. And majority of what is happening in Iraq is right now just starting to at least address the issues of the corruption, which was tied to every single individual that we supported in that region. Where did that money go? Nobody will know. Who knows where it disappeared to? But I guarantee you, the type of operations that ISIS did, these weren't just a Boy Scout team. These individuals, go take a look at the videos of the operations they conducted. Well-trained, well-financed, and that training and that financing sometimes may have a cover person, but it might be others that are behind it. That's just the reality of how today's battlefield shapes out. There's a political component to it, a military component to it, and an economic component to it. It always will have that.
So interesting. So another question. Any chance that the Iranian regime will be overthrown?
Depends. The Sunni states are in absolute chaos. It all depends on how the whole issue works out with the Sunni states. The Iranian regime, any regime can be overthrown. That's not an issue. The way the Iranian regime, the hardliners, protect themselves is by they ensure that the elected officials within Iran, quote unquote, of course, elected officials, are moderates. And it's a way for them to say to their people, look, you selected these individuals, they're moderates, to kind of keep the Iranian streets, quiet. If Iran is able to broker a new economic advantage for itself, I think you'll see money flow back into Iran, which will allow Iran to suppress any uprising against them. Because look, as we always say, is the economy stupid, right? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, if you're at least living decently, you'll be okay. But that's a decision that the people in Iran have to make. There's a lot of competing interests. And I just think from a global perspective, as Turkey is going to start suffering the same fate that Saudi is, which basically is inept at best and cannot do anything in the long run to save itself, I think that you'll probably see Iran emerge as maybe the lead for Islam within the region, and I think you'll finally see a new contract struck with the Iranians, which will solidify that regime for years to come.
So, Trump's sending 3,000 troops to Saudi Arabia. Do you believe that is, for protection, I guess, against Iran, but also an economic deal? I mean, Saudi's more than likely giving us a nice little bonus, the U.S. To have our troops there because, like you said, they're military. And I lived in Saudi for 4 years. I was a government contractor there with McDonnell Douglas, and I know exactly what you're talking about with that. And I was down in the Asir province. Uh, they've got a military that they're fairly well equipped, but they're not as organized. They seem to have a lot of issues with being cohesive and organized. And is that the case, or?
Saudi Arabia can only write checks. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, they're kind of disjointed, the military, anyway. At least that was our experience down where we were at the time.
Because they're tribal. They're Sunni tribal men. The Sunni Muslim Kurd is tribal. The Arab in Saudi is tribal. The Arab in Iraq is tribal. They're tribal. They're tribal mentality. The Persian, on the other hand, the Iranian of today, became an empire, the Persian Empire. It established itself. Nobody came and created it. The Middle Eastern states that you see today, from Iraq to Saudi Arabia to Jordan to Syria historically was there to an extent. The Assyrian Christians, unfortunately, fighting in World War I as British levies dying, were the ones who actually secured the borders of Iraq. How did the British repay them? They struck a deal with the French called Sykes-Picot, which was a 100-year contract. It was a 100-year contract. That's what the paper said. And they turned it over to the Arab tribesmen at that time because they wanted to have individuals that they might be able to control. And if those individuals decide to stand up against them, they could always destabilize them internally because of their tribal nature. Mm-hmm. The Iranian was an empire before he accepted Islam, and it is that unifying capability that he has within Iran that still allows him to use Islamic terror as a means to advance his national needs. Iranian is more problematic about the concept of Islam as he sees it. He knows that 9 billion people on this planet are not going to convert to Islam, and then this, this prophet, the lost prophet, will come back. He doesn't think that way. The guy who establishes Islamic State does. The one who establishes Al Qaeda does. The one who established Al Qaeda Iraq has that belief. That's more of a Sunni belief. But Iranian knows that's never going to happen. But Iranian will use terror where he needs to when he knows that he's under pressure and he has no way out. If you ever give him a way out, you'll be shocked. He may not decide not to use terror. Mm-hmm. Because ever since his revolution, the Iranian has looked at being him against the world, that everybody's out to get him. And that has more to do with the fact that Iran historically, every time has been at the apex of trying to be able to expand and get something done. It had a civil war that really destroyed its ability to project more than it could have projected. So that is always in the mentality of the leadership of Iran. They know their people, and which is why they project themselves in Sunni states as they do. The Arab tribesmen is always an Arab tribesman. He was placed into position of power when the countries were carved out, which is one of the reasons Turkey constantly sees all these nations as part of its Ottoman state. And it says that all these nations were taken from me after I lost in World War I. Going back to the Sunni Muslim Kurds, as just a side note, just so you know, and I know this question comes up, well, why don't the Kurds have a location? Because Kurds participated in the first genocide of the 20th century on behalf of the Turks, where 1.5 million Armenians were killed, almost 1 million Assyrians were killed, 500,000 Pontus Greeks. Majority of the Assyrians that were killed in the Hakkari Mountain were at the hands of the Kurdish tribesmen who killed them, who took their women into captivity. We had a blogger, an Assyrian blogger, that was in that was in northern Iraq, I think in 2015, and she was debating an issue and stated to the audience there that, there's no difference between today's Ottoman Turks and ISIS, and what they're conducting against the Assyrians today is the same as what the Kurds and the Turks did 100 years ago. There's a number of Kurdish men that were in that audience that challenged her. She asked a simple question of them. She said, I'll ask you a simple question. Is your grandmother Kurdish or was she Assyrian? And 8 out of 11 said that she was Assyrian. That woman didn't decide to become a Sunni Muslim Kurd because she wanted to leave her culture. She was taken to captivity. And today's numbers of the Kurds that you see, majority based on what happened then. And in 1933, the Kurds joined the Iraqi military and conducting a genocide against the Assyrians again. So the minorities in the region are always going to get beaten up as all these elephants are jockeying for their place within the region. And unfortunately, like I said, even with our having all our force structures on the ground, the Syrian Christians still were butchered, where they went from 1.5 million to 150,000 today.
Yeah, it's really sad that not a lot of talk is about the genocide of other ethnic groups like the Assyrians, like the Armenians, that took place. So Erdogan also made a threat, and it was a financial one, to the EU that if he didn't get what he wanted, he was going to send a wave in the millions of refugees that are in waiting in Greece and now also in Turkey. And well, France just recently, or just let's see, September 28th, Europe has really fallen hard due to their pandering. We had a lot of refugees go in 2015 and mass migration, and not always like the more moderate Muslims, but a lot of them extremists. And France has had more terrorist attacks than any of the other countries. Although there have been, grooming gangs and rape gangs and things like that throughout Sweden and the UK and everything, but they don't seem to characterize that as any kind of terror attack that France has seen, and like the Bataclan and Charlie Hebdo, things like that. Well, on September 28th, France's parliament passed a new law rule that disparaging Islam on any level, and a journalist reporting on another journalist doing that, is at risk of, prosecution. They've made it now illegal. They've not done the same thing for anti-Semitism, but they've done it for Islam. Is France just sinking itself, continuing to pander? Macron, whether it's for economic reasons, which seems to be the singular issue with him, and continuing to pander with Iran and these other entities. I mean, what's the future for Europe at this point? And what happens to Europe is really going to affect us and can really come to our shores. And like you said, it's been here.
Well, Europe did to themselves is amazing. The nations that receive the majority of the ISIS oil are the ones that have all the issues. I think you could read between the lines there. The Jews of France are leaving in droves. Shame on France for allowing that to happen. Foreign policy cannot be constantly always tied to dollars or oil. Mm-hmm. It's got to be tied to specific requirements that are going to advance us as a global community, both economically and on, if you want to call it, a moral basis. And I think sometimes when you have nation just completely lose sight of the moral obligation, I think they end up having more problems internally. Look, I'm not here to judge France. I know I say shame on them for allowing the Jews to leave in drones, because it shouldn't happen. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't happen. France will continue to have issues with ISIS operators a long time from now. What Erdogan is threatening to do was what we wrote in the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement on our first year anniversary, which was literally September 11, 2015. Go read the article. And we indicated how the refugees are now the new means and ways of keeping Europe hostage. Mm-hmm. Now, as much as Turkey is responsible for funding, supplying, and supporting ISIS, now that they're in Syria, they're going to have to inherit all these fighters. These fighters are going to move back into Turkey. Not only the fighters, though. You're talking about their wives, their kids, and even all the prostitutes that they flew in from Eastern Europe to basically, take care of the fighters. Close to 80,000 people that are going to have to be transitioned back through Turkey. Either they're going to stay in Turkey and be a destabilizing factor within Turkey, or they're going to have to go somewhere. And as the POTUS said, we're not here to babysit European ISIS captives. You're going to have to deal with that issue yourself. It might be a hard bargaining chip by the current POTUS against Europe, but again, I cannot allow my American soldiers, my brethren in arms, to go and die while nation states that have been somewhat, directly or indirectly, the reason why the current crisis globally exists, just sit there and do nothing. Mm-hmm. Case in point, look at even England, our closest ally. When the Iranians captured oil tankers, the British captured in so-called Iranian oil tanker that was taking fuel to Syria. We realized during that entire capture that the Brits held that oil tanker more to negotiate the release of one of their hostages. Oh, by the way, at the same time, the British sanctioned the Syrian Church of the East in England, their monetary funneling arm, which is a CIED, because they said that you went ahead and gave money to have Syrian Christian hostages released in Syria. So, because the church gave money to release the Syrian captives in Syria from the hands of ISIS, they were sanctioned. They cannot operate their businesses in
Who sanctioned
England.
them? Who sanctioned?
The British did. The British did.
Sanctioned
the UK. The Assyrian Church is saying that you shouldn't have given money to terrorists. But here you are trying to negotiate an entire oil tanker for the release of one of your hostages.
Wow.
So I guess, one hostage is worth an oil tanker because they have a UK flag on their shoulder, but, the Assyrian Church cannot negotiate for the release of their people in Syria so they won't get killed. In this case, women and children. Now, when we put pressure on UK and said, okay, if it's not about you negotiating the release of your hostages, then give us an oil tanker so we could put pressure on Iran, the British released it without giving it back to us.
Yeah.
Okay, these are European partners. Mm-hmm. So should I commit my American soldiers and U.S. taxpayer money to tune up billions to Syria and Iraq and other regions for what? So they can get killed? So as the president said, I write letters to the parents. Foreign policy for us has to be a long, enduring foreign policy. And Europe, as much as we want to help them, and if you go to the Near East side and read, we said that the contract that was struck with Iran was to save Europe at the cost of America financially. They need to clear up their financial messes. And one of my recommendations would be try not to be a socialist nation. It doesn't work. So, again, we have to come and try to clean up their messes that they have caused themselves. Unfortunately, I don't know if Europe's ever going to recover from the disaster that is burning through it, from Germany to UK to Belgium to France.
Yeah, I've watched over the years because I go overseas often, and just since the first of the year, I've been to Paris 3 times. I've been to Brussels as well. But over the years, I have watched a steady transition in Europe, a place that I lived, a place that I loved, and spent a lot of my youth there, change, and to their own detriment. I mean, they brought it upon themselves with their ideas. I attended during the United Nations General Assembly a summit in New York City, and it was in conjunction with the General Assembly. It was the summit against nuclear Iran, and Secretary Pompeo was there. Richard Grenell was there. A lot of other leaders were there, including the Saudi foreign minister was there. And one of the things that was brought out is exactly what you said. When we are switching foreign policy every 4 years, sometimes 8, but often every 4 years, in an election, and there's this flip-flopping of policies, that doesn't necessarily help America's position either, as far as, having a solid policy that our allies or those in the Middle East or wherever the issues are changing. And we've experienced that from our own allies ourselves in the UK and in the EU, with these policies changing according to what their immediate need or want is, whether it be financial. A lot of it's driven by financial. So would you agree that, it's really important to try to keep that foreign policy intact for a period of time to try to bring some stability for no one else, for our own military, for our own men and women in uniform?
The problem is our Congress, our system is set up like that. You ran for Congress yourself, and just so you know, I've started collecting signatures this year, and I'm gonna put in my bid to run for Congress this year for the 2020 election. But look, Congress is a 2-year process. I'll give you an example why our system just doesn't work. November of last year, you had.
And I ran on term. When I ran too. One of the things that was big for me was term limits. But I also think the terms need to change, because it seems like in Congress, and one of the things that I was really looking at when I was running, is that Congress has to run every 2 years. And yes, we get some bad apples in there, would like to get rid of them. But the fact is that what actually gets done in Congress in a 2-year period, when that following year you're campaigning again, for Congress, for office, and it's just a vicious cycle.
It's not even that. You can't look. 5 November, number of congressmen won. January of this year, I met with my party, and I think it was the 15th of January. We were talking about how maybe we can flip a couple of the congressional districts in Illinois. Well, Congress hadn't even sat in their seats, the new congressmen, yet. Why? Because the government was shut down. So we're already meeting on how to beat the individuals who just won in 5 November, haven't even sat down behind a computer to turn it on, to know how it works. Both parties do it. Now, February, when the government opens up, the first thing, all these congressmen that come in that want to make a change, they go in, and unfortunately, these individuals who are entrenched and gerrymandered in districts are sitting there for 20 years. plus, which is what dictators do in the Middle East, waiting to handpick their own, whoever they decide to have come in after them to sit in their seat, come up to you as a leadership on both parties and say, here's the bills that you're going to be working on, and here's what our plan is for the next election in 2020. If you did not agree with what they're giving you at the farm where they go to get their basically marching orders, you're not going to get on the committees you want. Okay, so you accept the committees they give you. You say yes, sir, yes, ma'am, in this case, maybe depending, and you move on. So the first filing of the person who's running against you is in April. April, we had folks that were filing their first filings for the quarterly filing to say, here's how much money we raised to run against a congressman who hasn't even been in their seat for 30 days. And that congressman sees it, goes, uh-oh, this individual's already raising money to run against me. The congressman's already been told by his party leadership, this is what you're going to vote on, whether you like it or not. If not, you're not going to have a say in the system. You know yourself, August recess is coming up, and what might be authorized budgetary-wise in the first half of the calendar, congressional calendar, may not be allocated in the second part of the congressional calendar. So if you are a congressman, woman, and you haven't been able to propose a piece of legislation before the August recess, you may not be able to propose one. Well, guess what? The second quarter filing is 3 months later. You haven't even been able to get through the process of getting something on a congressional calendar to get it to a point where you can actually propose maybe out of the committee into the congressional calendar, approved for Congress to look at, and your opponent, who's going to run against you from the other party, has already 6 months of money that they've raised to defeat you, and you're behind the power curve. Well, in Illinois, September 3rd is when we had to start collecting signatures. You, as a congressman who just won in November 5th, have to start collecting signatures in September 3rd. You have to be able to file in November to be able to be on the in a primary on 17 March. In this case, for us, St. Patty's Day. So you're stuck. You could get nothing done. And individuals who stumble into wins, not because they're prepared to come and run and understand how the system works, who stumble into wins, are not able to get anything done. So while these people are doing this, the leadership that is entrenched in the legislature is trying to their darnest, even under the current what's happening in Washington. It doesn't matter who the president is. It could be Trump, Obama, O'Connell, are trying to weaken the executive by all the steps that they're taking to make sure that they're entrenched in the legislature, that they could literally control the three branches of government. Because if you could weaken the executive, and the executive in the future, currently, the current POTUS is very aggressive as far as how he deals with the legislator, but it doesn't mean that the next executive is going to be able to be at his caliber of pushing back against the legislator. Legislators know that. So as much as they could degrade the office of the executive, now if they're still entrenched because of gerrymandered, they'll have a say as far as what they want with controlling the judiciary and the executive in the future. We don't have three equal branches of government. Who steps into this picture? Chinese, Russians, others through their contractual contacts to the individuals that are tied indirectly or directly or through foundations to these individuals. And then you turn around and try to figure out how the hell we're going to deal with Kurd in northern Iraq. You make one happy, the other one is angry. You make the other one happy, the other one's, has an issue with you. So it's complicated. It's not easy, but I think from a statesman perspective, if you get some good quality individuals who are in Congress, and in my case, I'm a little bit biased against it. I think that we should have individuals in Democratic and Republican Party that have served downrange, who have seen friends killed, who have tasted blood, because they understand the consequences, and they'd be more happy about burying the hatchets in the enemy's heads rather than their own heads. And then they could at least be a stabilizing factor for a short period of time with term limits to be able to guide us in the right direction. U.S. Will always be, by the blessings of God and grace of God, always be able to be in the lead. Unfortunately, these little things that are taking place currently are always going to be ankle biters in the region. But the Middle East is not going to change. Long after Trump has left, it's not going to change. Our foreign policy has to change to make sure that we protect the American citizen, make sure his money is not spent fruitlessly in areas where everybody just wants to misuse us, and put enough pressure on our allies to make sure that they understand that being an enduring partner is a two-way street. Not me sacrificing my men, my dollars for you while you pay Iranian protesters on the streets to scream debt to America so you could strike a better contract with the Iranian businesses, to force my companies to have to go through European companies to do business in Iran. No, it's not going to work that way anymore. And we got to get people in Congress that understand that and are able to put that pressure on our allies. Look, even our adversaries, for us to be able to break a decent deal with China on the tariffs, we got to allow them to have some kind of a footprint in Iraq, which is our held territory. And if you don't, we're not going to be able to alleviate that pressure, because they have to eventually make their money somehow to sustain their economy. And we cannot just cut them off completely. So there's value to working these maturations on the economic, political, and military lines of effort, but they have to work together in support of our long enduring policies. And I think the current POTUS hasn't shown me anything that says he doesn't understand that.
That's great. Let us quickly tell us what district. It's in Illinois, and what district. But I have people asking, where's he running? Because I think they've really enjoyed hearing your perspective on things, which is really great, because these are people that appear to want to get behind you in this run. And so let our folks know.
Well, it's a tough district. I'm going to be running against the incumbent Jan Schakowsky. She's been there for 20 years. I'm a Republican, of course, running in Illinois, which is a Democrat state. So it's going to be a tough race. It's not going to be easy. I got to flip 14 points, and that's just, there's a hard battle to engage in, but it's worth it. Because our country needs to change. Look, we have to have good people, both Democrat and Republican. But we got to have people who are willing to bury the hatchet, like I said, in our enemies' heads, not each other's. And we got to get some integrity and honesty back into Congress. I'm going to try my best from this end. I just gave a talk at the Republican woman of Park Ridge. I told them, look, I'm not really here to ask for your endorsement and vote. I'm here to ask you to rededicate yourself a little bit to making sure our country is stable again and is empowered. And really, that's it. All these things that are happening in the region, in the Middle East, other places, we got to look past them to a long-term perspective of where we want to be. And I think a strong America gives us an opportunity to help our allies and guide them in the right direction, because currently they're all over the map, and they're not helping us at all within the region.
Well, I wish you all the luck, and I definitely will have you back as many times as you'd like to get your message out. Let people know not only do you know what's going on in that part of the world, but your perspective and your experience bring a wealth of information. And, if and when, we're going to pray that you make it to Congress. And it is, running for Congress is a big deal. I don't think in a short period of time, worked so hard. There was very little sleep and debates. We had so many debates It was great. It was a great experience. I may do it down the road. I was kind of asked to do it this go round, but I've already kind of committed to some other things, but maybe in the future. But it is so important. And raise it, and what you said, I agree with. I like to see more military people serve. And we had quite a few actually run for Congress, but didn't win. We had quite a few Republicans. I had them on my show a lot. I did roundtables with different candidates from around the country after my race. But I ran on the motto of the military, service before self. Being raised in the military, the daughter of a military career man who is now buried in Arlington, that gave his all, who instilled patriotism in us and love of country, and yet showed us the world and showed us the hardships, the places in the world that aren't the pretty places. He took us to places that were, not the comfy parts of the world, and instilled patriotism and service. And I love that idea. Let's get more military in Congress, because they're the ones who decide, who's going to go and serve and where and when and make our laws. And military already serves service before self.
No, and look, for me, it's just a rededication of my 20 years in the service, or categorized by what you just explained. Dedication to our government, United States of America. And the flag behind you is what I wore on my body armor, my chest. When I went through a door in the Middle East to say hello to somebody, that's the first thing I saw coming at him. It didn't have Republican or Democrat or Independent written on it. Parties are just nothing more than a vehicle to get to the end goal. But I think the end goal has to be for the betterment of America. And I don't want to take time away from our discussion on the Middle East to talk about
but it's all
my run. It was kind of tied to the question that you asked.
Absolutely, and I think it is tied together, because if and when you go to Congress, and the people that serve in Congress affect what is happening in these regions as far as Americans are concerned. So I thought it was a beautiful tie-in, and we didn't plan it. It just was organic. But I'm really happy to know about it, and I think the viewers are too. And I think it does speak to, we need to be looking at candidates with this very important election coming up that are putting service before self, that are, know what's at stake.
I've briefed the National Security Council under both President Obama and Trump. We've had discussion at the Office of Secretary of Defense, Near East Affairs, Iraq and Syria desk. Still communicate with a lot of the folks, give advice, but I realize if you're not at the table, and you can't get anything changed. I mean, you get individuals sitting in certain committees that it boggles my mind when they talk. I try to send them as much stuff as possible, and you kind of wonder, how are they digesting this information, even for a guy who's worked in bureaucracies before. We gotta get our country moving in the right direction. Mm-hmm. The enemy is trying his best to destroy us from internal. This is not a game. It's life and death at the end. I hope that we get Americans to understand that, to work together. Look, you may not have been a patriot when you first joined the Army. You may have just gone in for the money itself. But at the end, when you come out, you're a patriot.
There's a brotherhood there. There's a
brotherhood there.
Mm-hmm.
You went through stuff, and you realize that, you know what? And there's a reality that punches you in the face every time it gets a chance. My first tour of duty, I got blown up 7 times. Like I said earlier, I have a soldier's perspective, which my friends in Pentagon are hurting about the POTUS's decision to leave the region, but I also have a statesman perspective that we can't operate this way. So you got to bring best of the two worlds in, understand where you got to kind of put the beret on and then go in and let everybody know who the hell you are, and then other times where you just got to go in and, be the statesman and make sure you're able to, work the two ends of the aisle and have folks come together for the flag behind you. We gotta just move the country in the right direction. I would recommend for the people who are having heartburns about everything that's happening in the region and the Middle East to kind of close it out in that fashion. Look, these things have been happening for 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. They're not going to change. People are going to try to exploit everything for their own economic benefit. They're going to try to exploit us as Americans. We're just going to be smart when they're using us. And if they're going to use us, I don't have a problem using them. As good as they give, we give better back to them twice. So some people you can't change their nature. You just got to use it against them or use it to your benefit to make sure you maybe in the long run are able to make some slight changes, modifications to their behavior. And some of our so-called allies, it may have to be where we put our foot on their neck, and every time they try to, look the wrong way, we just squeeze them a little bit, and then they realize, I'd rather be friends with the United States than to get individuals like a Colonel Sangari ticked off at me, because he might actually, not relent by pushing his foot on my neck. It's just how we have to operate. It's just nature of the people we deal with on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And we have to know who we're actually dealing with, and not turn a blind eye to the reality of who we're dealing with and what we're dealing with, for sure. And deal with that knowledge and how we form policies. So I won't keep you. It's late for you, but this is really great news for me to hear that you're going to throw your hat in the ring. And I like I said, you're always welcome to come in, talk about things that are important to you, get you out there as much as we can, because I think it's people like you that we could really, really use in Washington. And folks, thank you so much for joining us. We had a few technical difficulties at the very beginning, but I think tonight gave everybody a wealth of information. You gave it such a chronological and laid out also as to who the actors are, gave us a great clear picture, because I think it's been very confusing for a lot of people who may not understand the complexities of what's going on in the Middle East and all the different groups and people and ethnic groups and people that are involved, just besides the names that they always hear on the news, like, Erdogan and Iran and, Assad. These groups, like you said, have been doing this for a long time. So really great information. Great show for me. I loved it. I loved every minute. This was really great. So thank you so much for coming on tonight and having an extended show. It was great. Always great to have you.
Thank you, Debbie. I hope it helps. Like I said, it just, at the end of the day, is information, is how the people use it for their benefit. And thank you for the work that you do. Without you providing this opportunity, a lot of the information that we have probably will not be able to get to the mass public out there. So I hope it helps in the long run.
Well, I do my best. I think one advantage I have over some others is just that having experience living overseas as well as in the Middle East for 7 years. And that is something I kind of focus on, because I think, not everybody out there has had that experience and engaged with these people and understand somewhat how it's a very complicated area. And like you said, very tribal. So it's great to have that background to be able to help expand and bring guests like you on and have some sense of understanding. So I really appreciate it again. And folks, we're going to wrap it up, but I'm going to thank Lieutenant Colonel Sangari, and really appreciate your time and all that you do. And folks, like I always say, remember to fight the good fight, because they never give up the con. This is Debbie Aldridge signing off for tonight. Thank you for our Sunday special. Really appreciate it. Till next time.
God bless.